That Don't Sound Right is a podcast about talking the way we did before the internet, when you could not prove anyone right or wrong.
All the expertise was contained in the people involved with the conversation. I'm Peter.
I'm Cecil, and I hope you enjoy our conversations. And as you listen, if you find yourself silently saying, "That don't sound right," send us a comment. You're one of us.
Last week, Western North Carolina was destroyed by catastrophic flooding. We've got friends and listeners and friends who are listeners up in Western North Carolina, and our prayers are with you guys.
Welcome back to another episode of That Don't Sound Right, a podcast about talking. We're co-hosts. I'm Peter Billman.
And I'm Cecil Davis.
And we're just trying to have a conversation without using Google or fact-checking things online. Those things can so easily kill the conversation.
So this week, a good friend of mine from high school who used to have conversations with me like the ones we're having now sent me what has to be the perfect article about our podcast. And it's a letter from Car Talk. Now, you're a fan of Car Talk. I'm a fan of Car Talk.
Yeah. In fact, it's their banter. There's a couple of co-hosts that have either radio shows or podcasts. It's the banter that I really appreciate, and we're trying to somewhat capture that here.
Exactly. And this letter is called the Andy scale, if I remember correctly.
Andy's letter. The Andy letter.
The Andy letter. And it encapsulated perfectly what happened on Car Talk. But what is the premise of the letter?
Andy is thanking the two co-hosts for proving something for him. He had hypothesized something to be true, but they actually gave him significant evidence to prove his hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that two people actually know less than one person.
And I think if you haven't picked up on that in all 160 episodes, the episode about starboard and port
Sure.
illustrates this. We both are fans of Car Talk. That letter was perfect. Mike, thank you for sending it in. We are hoping to carry on that same tradition of proving that theory that two people talking about a subject can actually know less than one person talking about a subject.
And we're not trying to do that on purpose, but it appears that those are the best kind of experiments too, right? When the subjects don't know they're in the middle of an experiment.
That's right. And listener number one remembers hearing that episode live and laughing so hard, I think he had to pull off to the side of the road.
It makes me want to go back and listen to that episode.
Yeah, I'm going to go back and look it up. I think I've heard it because they were discussing electronic brakes on a trailer, and neither one of them knew about electronic brakes on a trailer. So,
which is fascinating to me because that's a pretty standard thing on trailers, electric brakes.
But you're a truck and trailer guy. This is one of those things that sounds perfectly normal to you. Because Peter and I have discovered another thing. Just because something doesn't sound right to us doesn't mean it doesn't sound right to the audience that it originates in.
That's right. And so we have to be, we try to be sensitive to that, right?
Yeah.
There's only 380 million of us in the United States, and there's billions of others in the world. And I'm sure our customs and things that we do definitely don't sound right to the majority of the planet.
Right. I'm looking forward to talking about your trip to India on a future episode. Speaking of other cultures.
Right. And there's over 1 billion people that live in a certain way that don't sound right to us, but perfectly normal and okay for them.
Well, tonight's episode is about negative feedback loops, which I realized probably 2/3 of our audience just switched off their phones.
Well, you texted me the idea of negative feedback loops. I tuned out of the podcast after you sent me that text.
You fell asleep.
What are you talking about, Cecil?
You fell asleep just reading that sentence.
I could barely get through your text.
So this will be another perfect episode of reaching back and remembering either my chemistry or my pharmacy days.
Well, these are my favorite. I love going back because, even though when you asked me the question, would I rather be a pharmacist or an engineer, even if I could do it all over again, there's parts of me that are starting to say more and more, being a pharmacist might have been pretty good. Might have been,
great.
Might have been okay. Until the episode where you said that you think pharmacists are a dying breed, then I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I don't want to do that.
It's a slow dying breed.
So wake me up with this negative feedback loop thingamajig that don't sound right to you.
So I was listening to a podcast. It's a great podcast that interviews scientists about what they're doing currently.
Now, let me ask you a question. Did you listen to the whole podcast?
Of course not. That was part of the podcast. I read the description of the podcast.
Oh, you just read.
No, I did listen to part of this. Is one I didn't get to the end of the episode, but I got enough to talk about.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Modern agriculture, modern farming is heavily dependent on fertilizer. And I think I would assume that most people know that. I didn't realize how dependent it was until this podcast. But so one of the things that's necessary for the heavy agricultural that we need to sustain the world's population is nitrogen. And so nitrogen occurs in the soil, but it has to be sequestered by microbes that live among the roots of plants.
So what does sequestered mean? Just to be clear, is it something? Is it more than is it more than just capturing and holding?
It's just capturing and holding.
Okay,
exactly right. So these microbes are capturing and holding nitrogen, but when you put fertilizer on soil, which you have to put it on there in the form of ammonium nitrate, and then it's converted to the nitrogen. That's very expensive, and it also can run off. What scientists are thinking would be a good idea is to have these little microbes sequester more nitrogen, which sounds like a great idea. However, these microbes work on a negative feedback loop. So when there's an adequate amount of nitrogen in the soil, these microbes quit sequestering, quit holding on to nitrogen. So the scientists have decided, and they're trying to do this, is to go in there and using CRISPR technology, which was developed at your son's soon-to-be alma mater, NC State.
What kind of technology?
So CRISPR is where you can go in and cut out a piece of genetic code and reprogram the microbes. That's a very simple explanation.
All right. Okay. So CRISPR is just genetic modification?
Yeah, just clipping pieces of genetic code.
All right.
So
that's how Jurassic Park made dinosaurs.
Yeah, right. So this is all Jurassic Park to me.
I think that we're proving the hypothesis more and more, but keep going.
Oh yeah. We're getting ready to go deep into two people not knowing about a subject. So they're using CRISPR technology to modify these microbes so that even if there's adequate nitrogen in the soil, they will keep hanging on to nitrogen. So in nature, that's called a negative feedback loop. If there's an adequate level of whatever, and whatever is holding on to it turns off when there's an adequate level, that's called a negative feedback loop.
So can I ask you some other examples of a negative feedback loop?
Yeah. So if your body was making a hormone, once it reaches a certain level, your body will stop making that hormone. That would be a negative feedback loop.
Okay, maybe I'm hung up on the term negative. What's a positive feedback loop?
I think there is a positive feedback loop. I think there's only a negative feedback. So negative is probably, if you're getting hung up on the word negative, it's just a rate limiting switch. So so think of it in engineering when you're measuring something and it reaches a certain level, it turns off a switch.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So could a positive feedback loop something that turns on the switch?
That's possible. I'm not sure if there is a positive feedback loop. We'll have to have some of our scientist listeners, if there are any, redescribe. The first letter will be that I've described the negative feedback loop incorrectly. That'll be the first letter we get. And then the second letter we get will be describing what a positive feedback loop is.
I gotcha.
But
I bet you there is a positive feedback loop that it. So if a negative feedback loop is turning on off a switch, then a positive feedback loop is something that turns on the switch and actually increases.
yeah,
In fact, it sounds like what you're saying is that the scientists are actually trying to is not to turn off a negative feedback loop, but to convert it into a positive feedback loop.
Right.
That things just keep going.
Yes. That to me doesn't sound right. That sounds like an automatic bad idea. That if there is a switch in nature that turns off something, whatever it is, I would think you would not want to turn that switch permanently on.
Well, so in this case, what do you think the ramifications are?
I don't think we can figure out what the ramifications are. I mean, you've now got microbes that are able to infinitely sequester nitrogen.
Well, I guess wouldn't the microbes have maximum capacity?
I don't know. There's so many questions I have about this. I probably should have listened to the whole episode.
No.
But my point is that if you have negative, anytime you have a rate limiting switch, even in engineering, it's there for a reason.
Yeah.
So like if you have, even like on a dryer, most people may not realize this, but your dryers in your home have what they call high limit switches. On a dryer, you have high limit switches. If your dryer gets too hot, it will turn the dryer off.
Right.
You would not want to override your high limit switch to make your dryer hotter because it could catch on fire.
No, that makes sense. So in the case of our microbes, what happens? What happens when you put too much fertilizer on your lawn? What typically happens?
If it's the wrong kind, you would burn it.
Yeah. So is that possible then that if your microbes sequester too much nitrogen, then it's gonna have too much nitrogen in the soil, and whatever you plant actually may not grow because you've poisoned the soil with too much nitrogen.
That would be a big question, wouldn't it?
Well, that would be my immediate hesitation to this scheme, and I could understand your reluctance to genetically altering a microbe, because then you could change the microbe's nitrogen levels to the point where nothing could ever grow again.
Yeah, it could. I think it could get weird. I mean, it's already strange because we're dumping so much ammonium nitrate to cause crops to grow. There's, I think on a future episode, we want to talk about the idea of Sabbath or sabbatical.
Yeah.
And so there are farming techniques that allow for a field to lie fallow every few years, like every 7 years, and recuperate, or crop rotation, which keeps a natural balance in the soil. I mean, we're already doing something fairly abnormal by dumping fertilizer on there to increase growth.
Right. And so the microbes kind of regulate that. So any nitrogen that's left over is just going to get it's going to run off. But because, nitrogen is about 75, 78% of our air. Yeah. So theoretically, there's already enough nitrogen in the air that that's surrounding the ground.
Right. It just can't be used out of the air. It's got to be captured in the soil. And that's what the microbes do.
But so the microbes can conceivably capture the nitrogen out of the air, right?
Just not enough to support modern agriculture.
But if you create a microbe now that has super capacity, those microbes should be able to absorb the nitrogen out of the air at a much higher rate and density. And now probably to the point where the microbes now have way too much and you've poisoned the soil. So you've been now you can poison the soil and burn your lawn with the air.
Yeah, now I don't know about that. I don't know if that's how it occurs, but that would be my concern.
That is a concern.
Yeah, and I don't know what the ramifications of it are. I would just be like, if there's a switch and you say, okay, we're going to tape this in the permanent on position, that just never seemed like a good idea to me. You need to fix the underlying problem, not fix it by just flipping the switch on permanently.
So there's a couple things, I guess, that don't sound right here. First of all is to you, it don't sound right that we should be messing with microbes' ability to hold nitrogen. And I think we've established the good reason why is that you could poison the ground.
We think. Now, we don't know.
Maybe another things that don't sound right is that why are you so concerned about this? Like what got you, what keeps you up at night about this? Seriously, what keeps you up at night?
Anytime you modify something, there's a chance that you are going to cause an issue. For all the listeners that we haven't lost already, I'll lose the rest with this. If you're building an engine, some people...
I'm out.
If you're building an engine and you want more horsepower, you can actually you can override the intake system to bring more air into the carburetor to increase horsepower. Or you can modify the exhaust to increase horsepower. But both of those things may burn your engine up.
No, you're correct in that case. So the idea is if we modify these microbes in such a way, they could burn out our plants. And those microbes could spread across the world into everything. And then now the soil is poisoned because there's now too much nitrogen in it. That would be my concern. I wonder if I'm sure the scientists have thought about this.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, how many times have we seen this type of thing happen historically? Like kudzu was brought into the South to control erosion. And now everybody agrees universally that that's probably a bad idea.
That was a bad idea. Well, the other thing is the guys and the gals snipping the DNA aren't the farmers.
No.
But hopefully there's soil scientists that understand how all this works, but they may not. They might be in a room thinking, oh, what if we were to do this? This might help with something. We don't have to put as much nitrogen in the ground. We don't have to create as much ammonium nitrate.
I have no doubt that the intentions are good. It's just that you cannot predict what's going to happen next. Again, like with kudzu, controlling erosion sounds like a great idea until you unleash a non-native plant that takes over and kills off other plants.
Yeah.
And you see it with invasive fish species that kill off natural species. You've seen it with other plants. There's a backlash now against the Bradford pear. Have you seen that?
I haven't heard about the backlash, but I have seen Bradford pears grow super fast. They actually spread, but then they're relatively weak trees. So when they get to about medium size, they completely get torn apart by the wind.
Some municipalities have bounties now on Bradford pears where they'll pay you to cut them down.
Really?
Yeah. So that's my whole point for the whole episode is just that if there's a switch that works, maybe you should just leave that switch alone.
Leave the switch alone. All right.
I mean, even on a truck, I'm sure you've seen over the years where guys or girls have overridden a safety device or overridden a switch, not in manufacturing, but in practice, like something's not working. We did it on cars. The computer on a diesel one time went bad. So we overrode the computer and hooked the glow plugs up directly to a cigarette lighter. And so we could actually charge the glow plugs without the computer.
There you go. That's nice.
With that, you can burn the glow plugs out because you've overridden the switch.
Yeah. There's a trick truckers use. So some modern trucks have forward collision radars. Mm-hmm. So if you're coming up on a car too fast, it'll beep at you. And if you come up to way too fast, it'll actually hit the brakes. Some of the truckers don't like the noises they make. So they get a candy wrapper or a chip bag that's made of foil, and they will put it in front of the radar on their front bumper. And it basically tells the computer that, hey, there's something wrong with the radar or deactivating the system.
Yeah.
So they drive around with a little yellow light on their dash, but now they don't have this thing beeping at them. But it's there for a purpose.
Yes.
If there's a car stopped and you're not catching it, you really want the truck to stop. You don't want to, plow into the car in front of you. So if you ever see a truck driving around with a Frito bag on the bumper, you know what they're doing.
This is my point exactly. They can get rid of the little yellow light with a car talk trick, just electrical tape over the yellow light. Then they don't have the light.
That's right. A little piece of black electrical tape. Now the light's off. Now there's nothing bothering you.
Right. So you've completely overridden that switch.
I'm curious to know some of the other negative feedback loops that we've disabled over time. Maybe I'm sure some of our listeners have encountered that or read entire articles or have listened to entire podcasts about these kind of things.
I think we could do a whole nother podcast just on safety features we've seen overridden over time.
No, that's true. And those things definitely don't sound right. Those are crazy. And looking in also some of the images that go along with those little tricks for overriding things are pretty spectacular.
I think we've probably overridden the safety switch on our listeners today, but you have come to the end of another That Don't Sound Right.
Well, before we close, we want to thank everyone for listening. If this is your first time and enjoyed the conversation, would you consider hitting the subscribe button on the platform you listen with? Also, if you're a longtime listener, please give us a rating and leave us a review so others can easily find us and join the conversation. I think we've come to the conclusion, Cecil, though, that many of our listeners are not so active on social media. And so if you'd like to take an ad in your local newspaper to promote the show, we'd appreciate that too.
Or write a letter to your friends. That Don't Sound Right is a production of TDSR Podcast in conjunction with Campbell City Studios. I am your co-host and sound engineer, Cecil. Peter is your other host and web designer. Camille is your barista. Emily is your graphic designer. Ella does your Instagram. Giorgio tests our merchandise, and we have new merchandise available. Brent is our international brand ambassador. And as always, listener number one is
Scott.
So until next week, keep talking.
Stay curious.